speak, that would be great, and that'll keep the clutter down. All right, Mr. Persily,
Okay,
the floor is
thanks.
yours.
I was going to say your intro was a polite way of saying I have a hard time holding a job. Actually, someone once in a presentation called me peripatetic, and I had to look it up. And when I realized it meant I couldn't hold the job, then I got pissed off at him. But so, so my understanding is you're hoping to talk about Hilcorp's takeover of BP and what it means and regulatory issues. But I thought I'd run through just some facts of the two companies to kind of set the stage for the change. And yeah, please interrupt anytime rather than wait till the end. So it's not just bigger, but BP's a lot bigger. In 2018, BP worldwide had about 73,000 employees. 2% of those employees were in Alaska. They had 1,600 or have 1,600 of the 73,000. Hilcorp has said publicly they expect to make job offers sometime in December to whichever number of those 1,600 employees they intend to keep. They have not shared their numbers, their target, and BP hasn't said how many of those they may keep or transfer outside. So 1,600 BP employees in Alaska out of 73,000. Hilcorp nationwide, it has no worldwide presence outside of the US. Hilcorp nationwide, according to their website, what I could find, a little bit more than 2,000 employees. Interestingly, whereas Alaska is 2% of BP's employees, Hilcorp is about 20%. They have more than 400 employees here. They also have employees in other areas where they're producing in Louisiana, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Texas, Wyoming, New Mexico, a little bit of production in Colorado. So Hilcorp, Alaska is a bigger portion of Hilcorp than BP is. If you look at their production, BP worldwide is running about 3.7 million barrels per day of oil equivalent. And it's oil and gas with the gas converted on an energy basis to a barrel of oil equivalent. BP, of that 3.7 million barrels a day, about 2% comes from Alaska. What they're transferring to Hilcorp now is about 75,000 barrels, give or take, a day off the North Slope. Of BP's 3.7 million barrels a day, it's heavily weighted toward liquids, oil. Oil provides 2/3 of their profit. They produce gas, but they are majority an oil producer, whereas Hilcorp, from what I can find, last year was nationwide producing a little bit more than 300,000 barrels per day oil equivalent, so less than 10% of BP's production. Interestingly, whereas BP primarily an oil producer, Hilcorp is primarily gas producer. 2/3 of their barrel of oil equivalent comes from gas, 1/3 from oil. And their biggest gas producers, Texas and New Mexico. Make no mistake, BP's leaving. It's great they found a buyer. I was there last month at the BP building here in Anchorage for a meeting, and they're literally selling the artwork off the walls. Actually, it's kind of nice. They have taken artwork off the walls at BP headquarters in Anchorage, setting it up in the lobby on just easels, and then they have silent auction sites with the proceeds going to the United Way. So they are definitely in the process of packing up and moving. Hilcorp was founded 30 years ago. It is the largest privately owned independent exploration and production company in the US. They don't own refineries. They are just an exploration production company. In the past 5 years, Hilcorp has completed more than $6 billion in oil and gas property acquisitions at $5.6 billion for the BP Alaska assets. It doubles what they have spent on acquisitions in the past 5 years. Huge bite for them. But since coming to Cook Inlet in 2012, when they started taking over assets in Cook Inlet from the departing big players, Marathon, Chevron, Unocal, ConocoPhillips, have all left Cook Inlet. Since Hilcorp came in 2012, started taking over those assets, they have worked over or drilled more than 100 new wells, and they've gotten good results from it. Cook Inlet production, for people who think oil was and always was the largest in, North Slope was always the largest producer in Alaska. Cook Inlet production before North Slope came around was substantial. Its peak was about 50 years ago, 1970, when Cook Inlet was pushing out close to 250,000 barrels of oil a day. It really was a big production. Unfortunately, that dropped, and by 2009, it was down to 7,500 barrels a day. It's more than double that. According to a state website, it was almost 18,000 barrels a day. This is from the Alaska Oil and Gas, from the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission website. So Hilcorp's managed to substantially increase oil production in Cook Inlet, and that oil's going to the refinery in Nikiski. Still not North Slope numbers, but they've had success, and Cook Inlet natural gas production has stabilized to the point that South Central utilities have their needs met. We're no longer talking about maybe bringing in liquefied natural gas imports to serve South Central because Cook Inlet was going to run dry. Just one point on that, people may have heard Marathon, which now owns that 50-year-old Kenai LNG plant in Nikiski, because Marathon took over Endeavor, which used to be called Tesoro, which had bought that property from ConocoPhillips a couple years ago. Marathon has applied to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to maybe turn that small old plant in Nikiski into an import terminal. They're in the pre-application process. There's no environmental review yet. I think that's maybe a little bit of a placeholder, but I don't believe Marathon applied to FERC to possibly turn the Nikiski plant to an import terminal because they're worried about Cook Inlet supply risk. I think it's just economics. They're paying high price for gas, for energy at the refinery. If they can find a cheaper supply, maybe it works for them. Just a couple other things about the companies. BP had been making charitable donations in Alaska at about $4 million a year of late. Hilcorp in 2018 made donations to Alaska charities of about $700,000. That's certainly nonprofits around the state are concerned about that. And I don't want to say it's a discrepancy. BP's a much bigger company than Hilcorp. Hilcorp has an interesting program, whereas BP and other large companies tend to write big corporate checks. Hilcorp has a couple different programs. They have a charitable trust for every new employee with an initial gift of $2,500, which is to be donated at the employee's discretion to a qualified charity or charities of choice. And then Hilcorp every year matches employee contributions dollar for dollar up to $2,000 a year. So it's more of a Hilcorp making money available. The employees get to pick. According to the website, this corporate giving program, since it was started, was given out about $14 million nationwide since its start. What's interesting is almost half of that has gone to religious organizations. Hilcorp itself isn't a religious organization or church sponsor. It's just, I guess, as I look at that and look at Texas and Louisiana and where Hilcorp employees live and where they operate, it's not surprising that if the employees are allowed to pick the recipient for the corporate match, that in that area, half of them are giving it to religious organizations. Also not surprising, of the $14 million given out in this matching program, only 3% has gone to environmental organizations. Honestly, I'm surprised it's even 3%. I don't mean that critical, it's just given the demographics. So I was going to talk about the regulatory process, but let me stop. Questions about the companies? sort of the differences between them, or Hilcorp's charitable program?
Doesn't seem to have any questions, yes.
None? Okay. So currently, the only public regulatory process underway in Alaska is the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, which is considering Hilcorp's 3 applications to take over BP's interest in the Trans-Alaska Oil Pipeline, the Milne Point Pipeline, and Point Thompson Pipeline. The RCA, Regulatory Commission of Alaska, has twice extended the public comment period on Hilcorp's application. You know, the RCA's job is to determine if Hilcorp is a capable and responsible operator of the pipeline. The RCA, the politics, spill response plan, corporate donations, how people feel about Hilcorp, that's really not their issue. They're a utility regulator, right? And a pipeline is a regulated utility with tariffs and showing you're financially capable of doing it. The controversial aspect, or from the public's perspective, the controversial aspect of the Hilcorp applications to the RCA to take over BP's interest in the pipeline is that Hilcorp has asked the RCA to hold the company's financials confidential. With each application, Hilcorp or its subsidiaries, Harvest Alaska, Harvest Midstream, has filed a motion requesting a waiver of the requirement that they file audited financial statements, and they have asked that they be treated confidential. And I think that's rankling, if that's the right word, members of the public, because Hilcorp is a private company. They don't file profit and loss statements with the Securities and Exchange Commission, with shareholders. It's a private company, much like I'm sure there's some people at the table who own private companies. They don't have to share their financials. There are hundreds, thousands of private companies in Alaska that no one much worries about. The fact that this would be a large oil producer certainly has attracted attention from legislators, from Alaskans. You know, Hilcorp, like I said, is privately held. They're not a publicly traded C corporation. And if you're a C corp, you have to file with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and your quarterlies, your financials, your profit and loss, all that's public. That's not the case. What Hilcorp wants to share, they share. One thing about Hilcorp's corporate philosophy, they pay bonuses rather than putting their money into salaries. So in 2015, Hilcorp is based in Houston, by the way. In 2015, they gave every employee a bonus of $100,000 because the company made its 5-year goals. And this was reported in Fortune magazine, Houston Chronicle. Their goals for that 5-year period, which ended in 2015, were to double their production rates, their reserves, their equity value. Those were met. And Hilcorp in 2015 gave everyone $100,000. If you were there less than 5 years, it was prorated, according to reports at the time. 5 years earlier, in 2010, every employee received either $35,000 in cash or a $50,000 car for reaching that 5-year goal in 2010. Hilcorp has gotten honors as best workplace for millennials and on Fortune's top 20 best companies to work for list. It was founded by a billionaire, a guy named Jeffrey Hildebrand. Like I said, doesn't have to file with financial regulators. I guess what's relevant here is because they're an LLC, limited liability company, Hilcorp does not pay Alaska state corporate income tax. Under Alaska law, S corporations, which are, I guess, they're corporations, but they're held by a limited number of shareholders and they're not publicly traded. So S corporations, limited liability companies, LLCs, limited partnerships in Alaska do not pay state corporate income tax. When state corporate tax law was written here decades ago, LLCs, S corps just really were not that relevant. as they become more and more popular, our law hasn't changed. So anyway, Hilcorp does not pay state corporate income tax, nor does it pay federal corporate income tax. However, at the federal level, all those profits flow through to the owners of Hilcorp, and they pay federal personal income tax on it. Any other state that doesn't tax an LLC, they get them at the individual level. Since we don't have an individual income tax, they don't pay. In terms of what the loss of corporate income tax will be to the state, because no longer will there be that slice of BP operations that allowed the state to collect a portion, corporate income tax on a portion of BP's income. Clearly, it would be highly dependent on how profitable oil prices, what's going on. You know, I'd say 30 million a year, give or take, is what the state would no longer collect by not being able to get corporate income tax from BP. Certainly, if oil prices were to spike back in the $100 range, it'd be significantly more than that. Hilcorp, however, will continue to pay royalties, production tax, property tax, same as BP, same as Exxon, same as Conoco. The LLC status has nothing to do with it. And I will say supporters of this takeover or the Hilcorp move, make the point that, look at what Hilcorp's been able to do in Cook Inlet and what they've been able to do in the lower 48. They buy mature assets, they boost production, they lower cost. So yes, Hilcorp may not pay, well, not may not, will not pay corporate income tax in Alaska, but if they produce more oil at a lower cost, the state will get larger royalty checks and larger production tax checks. And it's certainly possible that an increase from more oil at a lower cost, that increase in royalty and production tax could negate the loss in corporate income taxes. So like I say, I think the RCA is the only state regulatory public process that I'm aware of. There is a joint hearing coming up, 2 p.m. December 16th, a joint meeting of House and Senate Resources. Invitation only. My understanding is it's just going to be state agencies, not BP or Hilcorp, but I'm sure that could change. The House and Senate members, I expect, are going to hear from the Regulatory Commission of Alaska, Department of Natural Resources, Department of Revenue, Environmental Conservation, the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. My understanding is what legislators want to ask state regulators is, so what's involved in this transfer? What are the requirements? What process? Help educate us. It's an informational hearing. The Dunleavy administration says it's reviewing the Hilcorp purchase, but they're not sharing any information. You know, on a federal level, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which regulates pipeline tariffs on interstate transport of oil, same as the Regulatory Commission of Alaska regulates in-state transportation of oil. FERC will have to approve the transfer from BP to Hilcorp of the tariff and ownership in TAPS. I don't think that's going to be an issue. I really don't. You know, there'll be, I would expect, I'm sure BLM has it, or BP has its name on federal leases or rights of way. I think those should transfer smoothly. You know, Hilcorp, what they're doing is they're buying 100% of the stock in BP Alaska Exploration, Inc. So really, it's just new shareholders. They're just buying all the stock of a company whose name is on leases and other agreements. They're just becoming the new shareholders of it. So I think that was probably a smart move on their part. I will say the Federal Trade Commission looked at it and said, well, I don't have any problem with it. You know, you're merely swapping out one minority interest holder for another. BP didn't or does not own a controlling stake of the North Slope of Prudhoe Bay or of TAPS. They're a minority owner along with Conoco and Exxon. They're just swapping out another minority owner. Even with this purchase, Conoco is still going to be the #1 producer in Alaska. Hilcorp would move up to #2. You know, people may remember 20 years ago, BP was going to purchase Argo Alaska. and they did run into significant antitrust issues. The Federal Trade Commission said, hey, boy, this is going to give BP majority ownership control up on the slope, taps, and Federal Trade Commission had major heartburn about it. The state initially, under the Knowles administration, thought it was a good idea. Then members of the cabinet convinced the governor, no, the FTC is right. There's some problems here. So with a negotiated deal, the BP-ARCO state charter agreement, which was signed 20 years ago, allowed the deal to go through. BP consented to sell Alaska production to Phillips, which later became ConocoPhillips. So by separating out the Alaska stuff, it brought the new BP, after taking over ARCO, back under that majority control threshold on the North Slope. But, this is different. 20 years ago, BP, if it had bought all of ARCO and not had to divest of anything, would have become the controlling dominant player. Well, like I said, Hilcorp's just going to be a minority owner, different name on the shares than BP. So I'm not surprised. The Federal Trade Commission said no problem here. I'm, in this case, with Hilcorp BP. Just some context of what's going on. This is not unusual for one of the majors to sell out its assets in a declining, mature field. It was reported last week that Exxon is looking to sell up to $25 billion of assets it has in Europe, Asia, and Africa because it wants to free up cash to focus on bigger, newer projects. It wants to increase spending on new developments, and they're looking to put money into big new projects in Mozambique, Papua New Guinea, Brazil, Guyana, the United States. In recent months, Exxon exited from Norway, sold off its assets there for $4.5 billion. It's also looking to sell some assets in Australia, Nigeria, Malaysia. Chevron and Exxon are concentrating a lot of their investment in the Permian Basin, which is West Texas and eastern New Mexico, which is up to several, I think it may be 5 million barrels a day of production. I haven't looked lately. BP is still looking to sell some more assets in the U.S. They've got some property in the San Juan Basin in New Mexico. Conoco is looking to sell a position it has in Louisiana, reportedly for about $1 billion. It's just, this is what they do. They focus on their core areas and new plays, and when something's in the mature declining status, they exit it. Conoco this fall sold its older business in Northern Australia to a company called Santos, an Australian producer, for about $1.5 billion. It had some operating interests in an older LNG plant, a small one, and some gas fields out there. So I know some people think, oh, well, BP doesn't love us. No, this one was preordained. It was, I think, eventual, besides BP still had to raise some cash to pay off from its spill in the Gulf. But they're just looking for where they can put money for the next big new project rather than continue to devote money and staff time to declining reserves. Just a few things in the charter agreement, which I understand is out there for people. Another thing to think, 20 years ago, and the charter agreement talks about competition, diversity, growth. 20 years ago, we were at 1.2 million barrels a day on the North Slope. We're now down to 500,000, give or take. So a little bit different time as you think about sort of the context of it. The agreements in the charter between BP and the state that, as I read through this again, a lot of it is a kind of squishy language where it said under facilities access, this notion that, well, I'm a big company, I own some facilities. What if a small company comes around and wants to use my stuff to produce from a new field? And this talks about how the Commissioner of Natural Resources has the authority to require owners up there to provide access to their facilities for third parties for new entrants. And these have to be on just and reasonable terms. And the second paragraph there says, BP and ARCO currently take no position on the state's view. So they didn't really agree to anything other than, yeah, just and reasonable sounds fine. It says neither BP nor ARCO will unreasonably withhold their support for facility owners. It didn't require them to, well, you got to make everything available at 10 cents or $1 or 50 cents a barrel. It's kind of the good faith, just and reasonable. Yeah, sure, we're all in favor of other people using it. A couple other notes in here said that if BP ends up with surplus ships for the Alaska trade, they have to offer to sell the surplus ships to other producers on reasonable commercial terms. Again, pretty squishy. What's reasonable? Then it's got a whole section in the charter agreement about gas that BP shall negotiate in good faith to make the gas available from the North Slope at commercially reasonable fair market price or transportation charges. Well, we all know how that went. It's not economic. Doesn't matter what they want to do with it. So, I am kind of curious on the ships. So Hilcorp doesn't own any oil tankers. And if you're going to take Alaska oil to West Coast refineries, you need Jones Act tankers, and there are not that many of them around. I have not seen any public reports as to whether Hilcorp is going to lease the ships BP use or contract with the ships that BP uses. BP has a refinery that they take Alaska crude to, and the refineries in Anacortes and Puget Sound. I have not read any public reports, not just how Hilcorp's going to move its new 75,000 barrels a day of North Slope production, but whether there is any side agreement with BP to deliver that crude to BP's Anacortes refinery. I would assume so. That refinery is tuned to run Alaska North Slope crude. I would assume BP wants it. But I just assume that's probably some private commercial contract between Hilcorp and BP as to how to move the crude and whether or not there's any requirement or contractual obligation or deal to move it to the BP refinery that's been processing it for decades. One other comment I was going to make about the charter agreement, on page 11, it talks about the community charitable commitment, and it lays out the formula for the new BP to make charitable contributions, which, like I say, they're doing at the clip of about $4 million a year. I didn't see anything in the charter agreement that says this ends on a certain date, or this ends if BP out of London is no longer the shareholder of BP Alaska Exploration Inc. I would expect that at the legislative hearing, someone would ask, so what happens to the community charitable commitment in the charter agreement? Does that disappear with the sale? Does that get picked up by Hilcorp? Does BP continue writing checks even after they leave Alaska? As someone who sits on a couple nonprofit boards, I'm curious, but I have not seen any reports as to what's going to happen with that. So that's probably enough talking for me. I should open up to questions and discussions, if that's okay.
That's so RCA hasn't ruled on the financial request from Hilcorp yet.
No, they have not. Public comment doesn't close. I think it's December 13th. They've extended a couple times.
What is the advantage to the state to offer that concession? I really don't see any.
Well, I guess, so the RCA would know their financials. The state would know their financials. Even though they don't pay tax, they would still have to file with the Department of Revenue. So I guess if I trust the RCA to make the decision that Hilcorp is financially capable of doing this, then it becomes a question, do I need to, or do I get to see their financials? And I suppose that's what RCA is going to have to decide. I guess there's no advantage. Well, I wouldn't say advantage is the right word. Clearly, Alaskans are curious and would like to see Hilcorp's numbers, but as a private corporation, they guard them strenuously. I'd be kind of surprised if the RCA denies their request and shares their financials. I guess I would say, what would be the public purpose? I'm curious. So, the RCA is going to have to decide, is the public interest to see the financials or not? And what's Hilcorp's interest? Well, I shouldn't say Hilcorp's interest. Hilcorp's rights. There may be some precedent on this from other filings. I don't know. Did I lose you guys? Hello? Oh, there.
I'm still here, Larry. I can still hear you.
Yeah. Did we lose him?
I don't know. This is Representative Hopkins listening on the phone, so
Yeah.
maybe we lost him at the office.
Well, I'm looking on this board here. It shows Fairbanks FEDC with a red line through the phone. They may have, you guys muted yourself by mistake.
Go on.
Okay. Well, third try. This
Okay.
should be a win.
Okay.
This is
All right,
Rick
there you
Seifert
go.
in Fairbanks. Yeah, hello. I'm concerned about what is the rationale, or what's the speculation of the rationale of why BP is keeping the liability for dismantlement of the pipeline in this obligation, and what about the financial situation of Hilcorp leads them to do this? And what about money that's spent in the tariff dispensement that goes to a purported fund to handle that ultimate dismantlement? Will Hilcorp pay that? And if so, will they pay it into an escrow so we know how much it is? And is Hilcorp fundamentally capable of liability in case of a pipeline oil spill?
Well, I think there's two questions. One, I think, is Hilcorp financially strong enough, should there be a spill from the pipeline or Prudhoe Bay or one of the other operations up there? Do they have enough financial wherewithal to cover their share of it? Because it would be shared with the other owner operators, Conoco and Nexon. No, I don't know. I mean, I think maybe, but I guess it depends how much. If it's a $1 billion spill that's split three ways, give or take, probably they can cover it. If it's a $30 billion disaster, like I think when BP spent more than that on the blowout in the Gulf 10 years ago, no, I don't think Hilcorp's probably got 30 billion. So that's one question. Do they have the financial wherewithal to be responsible should there be an accident? The other question about the dismantling and rehabilitation or restoration of the pipeline. So the TAPS owners from the beginning have been building into their tariff and collecting money so that when the day comes that they have to dismantle and restore TAPS in the right of way, they can pay it. BP has said publicly they are not walking away from that obligation. When that day comes, BP will still pay its share because it has been, in theory, through the tariff, collecting that. But, and many people would say one of the shortcomings of that was there is not a distinct, separate, publicly disclosed account at BP, Conoco, Exxon that says how much has been collected and where it is. It's not a permanent fund balance sheet you can look at. But BP has said, yes, they are accepting that when that day comes, they will still be responsible. I have not heard from, let's say if this closes March 20th, 2020, just to pick a number, I haven't seen any discussion of, okay, if BP is still good for the money that's been collected till then, what happens from that day forward? Does Hilcorp build into its tariff money for dismantling and restoration? Does it get sequestered out or in a separate account? And I would think that's something that FERC and RCA, when they look at the tariffs, should ask, because I don't know the answer to that.
Other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I have a question regarding the charter
Actually, go
agreement.
ahead and, everybody identify themselves.
Okay,
That way
yeah,
they're-
hi, this is, Lisa Baroff in Fairbanks, and
Mhm.
I had a question regarding the charter agreement that kind of ties into what you were also just saying about Will Hilcorp. What happens once the sale goes through and BP stops putting money into this dismantlement, but also you spoke a lot to the charter agreement, which is up on the wall here, on the screen here. One of the things that I've seen in LTEs and also in comments submitted is a call to create a charter agreement. Can you speak to that and the need
Sure.
for that being a means to answer some of these questions as to how they move forward?
Yeah, and I've talked to a lot of legislators who are interested in replicating the 1999, 2000 charter agreement with Hilcorp. I think the difference is BP needed that for the state to drop its opposition to the takeover and for the Federal Trade Commission to let it go through. In this case, since there is no antitrust issue, you don't have the you don't have the leverage with an antitrust issue before the Federal Trade Commission. So would I personally like to see some agreement between the state and Hilcorp? Yeah, I think it'd be great. You just don't have the leverage because you don't have the FTC there threatening to hold it up. Does that make sense?
Yes, thanks.
Other questions?
I'll ask one. Gary Newman here, also in Fairbanks. The Conoco also says they're planning on selling some assets too. And I know there's a little concern that would, if Hilcorp was able to financially pull it off, and that may be in question, that would put them in a majority stake. Can you generally speak to that?
Yeah. So Conoco's not selling off assets as much as it's looking at billions of dollars of investment in their plays out in National Petroleum Reserve Alaska, Willow, they did CD Moose's Tooth 1, Greater Moose's Tooth 2. They're looking at Willow and others. What Conoco has said is right now we're 100% owner of those prospects, and these are going to cost billions of dollars. We're going to do here just like we do everywhere else. We're going to look for partners to share in the development costs. So Conoco has said on those new prospects, they're looking for minority partners. They do not want to sell control. They want to take in someone, 25% or whatever it is, who will help them fund it, because otherwise it's a lot of money and a lot of risk just for Conoco to do by itself. So I guess you're right. If, let's say, the prospect Willow, I think they're talking 100,000 barrels a day at peak. So if Hilcorp became the 25% partner with Conoco, I don't think that would make Hilcorp number one, because if it did go to 100,000 barrels a day and Hilcorp owned 25% of it, they'd get 25,000 barrels. Conoco would get 75,000 barrels a day and would actually increase their lead as number one. So yeah, Conoco is just looking for partners, not to sell out.
Thank you.
Mr. Mill?
Yeah, howdy, Clark Mill. I just had a question of whether you haven't touched on the safety level and the safety culture at Hilcorp. Are you on top of that at all? Will that come into this discussion?
Was BP?
Well, right. So Hilcorp's had some issues up on the North Slope and in Cook Inlet, but they're not issues for the RCA, I don't believe, for their jurisdiction. I would think if I were a legislator at that December 16th hearing, I would ask those questions of the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, which is, well, you've had some problems with Hilcorp. How confident are you that those have been resolved? Do you expect, again, if I were a legislator asking the oil and gas regulators, I'd say, with Hilcorp's past record, do you intend to step up enforcement or inspections as they become a bigger operator or the operator up on the slope? I would ask questions of environmental conservation, which is, given the pipeline spill you had in Cook Inlet and the response time to that, do you have concerns with Hilcorp? Are you going to step up inspections or reporting requirements? So I think I haven't seen the answer from state regulators as to what they think and what their response is going to be. And it's not like BP was perfect either. They had problems with wellheads and some pipelines up there. But I would think legislators would and should be asking that of state regulators at that hearing December 16th. Because the public, like you say, Hilcorp's had some issues. I think Alaskans want to know, what are the regulators going to do about it? If anything, not do about it in terms of punishment in advance for something that hasn't happened, but how are the regulatory agencies going to treat Hilcorp becoming a bigger player?
Question here.
Yeah.
Hey, this is Sean Lowry in Fairbanks as well. So you've done a pretty good job of outlining their business model and what they've done in the Cook Inlet. They have come in, they have invested, reduced costs for their own, but yet they've turned around and raised the price of gas and created a monopolistic society down there for natural gas in the Cook Inlet. Do you see that as decentivizing anything to be able to monetize North Slope gas, especially when it's going to come right into that market as is designed at this point?
You know, I guess not to sound like defending Hilcorp, Cook Inlet in the last, even before Hilcorp got there, was getting to be very high priced gas. There's just no competition. You know, someone else could have bought the Conoco assets or the Marathon assets or the Chevron assets, but no one did. It's not a great, anyway, so yes, it is a limited supply, captive market. Natural gas prices in Cook Inlet are significantly higher than anywhere else in the country. No doubt about it. But I guess I'm not sure from a public policy perspective that is a reason to oppose their takeover of BP's operations. I understand, you know, where people are concerned, but in terms of North Slope gas, I doubt that when Hilcorp agreed to $5.6 billion to buy BP's assets on the North Slope, I doubt they assigned much value to the gas. I really do. I think Hilcorp, as the other producers, are pretty realistic that there's probably not a gas line coming anytime soon. So I think also Hilcorp's smart. If there ever were a gas line off the North Slope, they wouldn't be getting the same $7 per 1,000 cubic feet that they get out of Cook Inlet. So as I've gotten more cynical on the gas line, I'm less concerned about what Hilcorp's going to do with the gas. If someone really came up with an economic project, financially viable project that the market was willing to pay for, I'm sure Hilcorp would be happy to sell its gas. That'd be a bonus up there.
Other
This
questions?
is David Guttenberg with a question.
Yeah.
On the phone?
David Guttenberg of Fairbanks.
Yeah, I can hear
Go ahead,
you.
David.
Larry, thank you for, tracking in your insights on all these things. For years, BP has been deducting and doing all sorts of things except creating its own account for the DR&R money.
Right,
And
yeah.
they're writing off their taxes and all kinds. Where is that money and what happens to it now?
Right, we talked about that. There is, I think that's one of the weakness of the dismantling restoration accounts that BP, Conoco, Exxon have been charging in the tariffs. There is no distinct account anybody can look at on a balance sheet. That was the way it was set up long ago. I think many of us agree it probably should have been done differently. But so BP has said, hey, don't worry, we're still good for our share, but you cannot point to a line on BP's financial filings that says, oh, here's the line that's saved. So, and I don't think this is, well, I don't know what Hilcorp plans to do once they take over.
Other questions on the phone?
Joe Burns, I see you're off mute.
Okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, you may.
Larry, Bruce Campbell,
Hi.
if we know about the shifts in the disposition of the oil and gas, could in some wild envision Hilcorp refine and ship refined products out of Alaska?
Well, there is some spare capacity at the Nikiski refinery, which they don't own, Marathon owns. So And some North Slope crude does go to from Valdez by tanker to the Nikiski refinery, but that refinery can't take,
I mean, yeah, Hilcorp's not a refining corporation, but
right, exactly.
if they wanted to be, they've got the assets. They could refine it all if they wanted. It's one of those things the state didn't get out of our original agreement.
Right. So the question is, could Hilcorp build a refinery in Alaska? Yeah. I would bet you my house and my entire IRA that they have no interest in building a refinery in Alaska. I'll even throw in my 13-year-old Volkswagen diesel Rabbit or Beetle.
Oh no. Hilcorp has been on the outside on the North Slope and one of the other minorities who did not have direct access to the pipeline. Having that experience, is there a chance that that'll be easier for other players to become producers on the North Slope and get better access to the pipeline?
Yeah, probably. And Hilcorp, I should have said, I think it was 4 years ago, they did buy some North Slope assets from BP, Liberty, Milne Point, and another field they took some interest in. So Hilcorp has production on the North Slope and is going to be the operator of Liberty when it goes on. I think we're seeing what you asked about. We're seeing it already with Mustang, which is Brooks Range, has come on. Not very many, a few hundred barrels a day. Repsol is working up their Oil Search, entirely new players, putting a lot of money and effort into developing its properties there. And I don't think Oil Search, I don't expect Oil Search would be looking at spending billions of dollars to develop their property if they thought they weren't going to be able to get into the pipeline at a reasonable rate. So I think that looks pretty good for that.
Because there has been an issue in the past. That was part of the reason Phillips had left.
It has, but I guess my advice to Alaskans is, it's been an issue in the past. The fact that Repsol and Eni, the Italian oil companies producing up there, and Oil Search, which is spending a lot of money on developing its properties and assembling a big staff. I guess I would say it looks to me like we're past that. These companies wouldn't be here if they thought it wasn't profitable to produce on the North Slope and pay a tariff and get money into a pipeline, even if they don't own the pipeline.
Different, broader question, Larry. Bruce Campbell again. You mentioned Hilcorp as one of the largest privately owned corporations in America, and
privately owned for oil and gas.
Oil. Yeah. Are there other entities out there besides Hilcorp who've expressed an interest that we've heard of who might be someone else? Because if BP is leaving, and Hilcorp already has a position in Alaska, could we do a lot worse?
I don't think it's a matter of doing a lot worse. I'm not sure there was anybody else that was really legit that could afford this. It's got to be someone who has the financial wherewithal to invest in places like Liberty, which can cost a lot of money to bring online and wait for the cash flow. You look at the majors, Shell obviously gave it a shot in Alaska. They're not coming back. Chevron's left. Anadarko doesn't even exist anymore as a company. It was bought out by Occidental. So you look at the other options, and if the majors like Shell and Chevron are done with Alaska, and Anadarko, who some years ago we were betting on to be our next savior, Anadarko doesn't exist anymore. Probably Hilcorp was the best solid option out there that I can think of.
Larry, this is Bruce again. I'm asking because there's social responsibilities both ways.
Right.
Fairbanks has had a long history of railing against big oil. From, the story I've heard was Bill Wally virtually personally drove BP to Anchorage, and so what we have downtown are rotting concrete old hotels that are our legacy of the type of discourse that we've engaged in. And rather than coming up with solutions, we tend to rail to moon. And Hilcorp, from what I see, is tight, small group, and they tend to they could easily take stuff personal that wasn't meant to be, and they don't have to engage in the same way BP felt they needed to drive around in a yellow Volkswagen Beetle, to speak of past history.
My guess is Jeffrey Hildebrand, who's owns Hilcorp. If you're that rich, you probably have a thick enough skin. You're not going to take it too personal if people write letters to the editor criticizing you for whatever it is you have or haven't done yet. I think, Alaska, certainly the oil and gas industry is changing as BP leaves. There's 60 years. It's hard to get a divorce after 60 years. I don't think we should take it personal, though. I think if Hilcorp can show they can meet the regulatory standards, the financial standards, and they're willing to invest in Alaska, hey, that's great. It'd be nice to clear up some of the unknowns about corporate contributions, or whether the charter agreement continues. How exactly are BP and Hilcorp going to handle dismantling and restoration and the tariff money? I think those are legit questions, but Hilcorp's probably was the best option out there. Yeah. Also, in terms of someone who was not just in harvest mode, Hilcorp said, hey, my guess is Hilcorp looked at the seismic, the well logs, all the information, and said, okay, how much more oil do you think we can get? How much more than that? How much can we do it more efficiently? Do the math, look at present day value, and how much is it worth today? So I think they agree on $5.6 billion because they think they can get more oil and more profit, which is good.
Question here in the room.
So, this is Richard Green up in Fairbanks. My question goes more to today's presentation rather than the content of it or the format of today's presentation. Having been a member of a lot of statewide organizations, or several, I should say, not a lot, and being the recipient of your sage advice and your constant, very welcoming comment, and very educational, I know you've been beneficial. It's incredibly beneficial that for a lot of folks to be able to hear your interpretation of events. And so, bearing in mind your work history, job relocation a lot, do we still have that to look forward to going forward? And I guess that's the question. We can be able to benefit from your interpretation with your current position?
Even more so, because now that I'm quasi-retired, this is not a full-time teaching appointment. I was up in Fairbanks a couple weeks ago, spoke at a panel put together by the League of Women Voters. Yeah, I'm a family, and I'm happy to help people with research and talk to people because I guess I'd like us to come up with the right answers.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions before we?
Actually, may I, Jim?
Yes, please, Jomo.
I do have a couple of leading questions, Larry. This is Jomo.
Right.
I wish I hadn't identified myself right now.
I recognize your voice. Don't worry about it.
And so does everyone else. So if we can flash back to the North Slope, BP ARCO, can you remember the scale, the percentage of market control BP ARCO without divestment would have created?
Oh, yeah. Can I give you something more than 50%? No, I can't remember, but it was a majority ownership of TAPS. Okay. Yeah, but I don't remember the percentages. Okay. And just real quickly on that, so keep in mind, TAPS is owned by, Hilcorp when they buy out, take over for BP, Exxon and Conoco. Conoco and Exxon are going to have a big say in what happens at Prudhoe Bay, where they have an ownership stake, and what happens with TAPS. It's not like Hilcorp's going to be able to just make their own decisions. As we know, the companies have to agree among themselves on big capital investments like the redesign on TAPS or other big investments at Prudhoe. So I'm sure as we're asking questions, I expect that Conoco and Exxon are having similar discussions with Hilcorp about, welcome to the table. Let's talk about how it works here. Anyway, sorry to interrupt, but I thought I'd mention that.
No, thank you.
You had another question, though.
Back to jump to the Cook Inlet,
Yeah.
if I may. So I've seen information, public information regarding Hilcorp in the Cook Inlet, and that their ownership stake, production capacity, their control is over 60%. That sound about right?
I'm sure it's even further than that, but yeah, go on.
I got some anecdotal information when I was over at the Interior Gas Utility, but I just saw it confirmed a couple of weeks ago at the IGU board meeting in a public presentation using state information. The lift cost coming out of Cook Inlet is somewhere between $2 and $3 an MCF.
Okay.
And yet Hilcorp is charging somewhere more like the $7 and $8 range.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So an entity with
yes.
vast market control charging what is publicly disclosed as being well over multiples of the actual lift costs coming out of the inlet, for which the state provided hundreds of millions of dollars of subsidy to get those prices. I just wonder your thoughts on, was there any opportunity to possibly redress that situation through this current situation on the North Slope?
Well, I've talked to some legislators who said, hey, can we use this to leverage them to cut the price of gas in Cook Inlet? And that was the question, right? And
I'm glad it came from that.
Yeah. So, I guess what leverage, though, since there's no Federal Trade Commission threatening to block it, then it just comes down to, hey, I'd like to talk to you, Mr. Hildebrand. I can't legally stop this merger or takeover, but, you know, it'd go over a lot better with the public if you cut the price of gas in Cook Inlet. Not that we can force you to do it, not that we can hold up the takeover up on the North Slope. I'm sure the state could have that conversation. I'm not sure a lot would come from it. You know, Cook Inlet is certainly a problem. Other companies, Fury, tried getting into the Cook Inlet gas business. They went bankrupt. Part of it is because the state stiffed them on the tax credits, but it's a tough market. And it would have been nice if Fury could have succeeded and produced a lot of gas and driven the price down, but they couldn't. It didn't work for them economically. They had problems aside from the tax credit non-payment from the state. And in hindsight, yes, did the state really think through and do a great job of paying out all those tax credits over the years in Cook Inlet? Nah, probably not. That was not a high point of state history. That's unfortunate. That money's gone, and we probably could have done a better job of negotiating for ourselves in the public's interest. One of those many things you can look back on Alaska and say, boy, if I had that money back, if I could have done that different. But,
well, it sounds like at least, it sounds like almost on a return basis, though, at least it's given them the wherewithal to become that new hungry player on the North Slope.
Right, and they have spent, initially they were spending like $300 million a year on Cook Inlet to increase production, do well workovers, work on platforms to get more oil and gas out, so we didn't have to worry about supply in Cook Inlet. So it's kind of a trade-off where you paid more, but at least you got enough. And I realize it's another problem for the IGU, because by the time you buy gas at 7 or 8 and liquefy and truck it up, you're getting pretty expensive gas or back in your pipelines. So, yeah, I'm sure the state could ask Hilcorp that. I just don't see where they have any legal right or leverage to force lower prices in Cook Inlet. I think the best way to do that would be competition, and that hasn't quite worked out.
Okay, let's ask the phone lines. Does anybody have a question on the phone before we sign off here?
Oh, hold on, I'll unmute you all.
Or raise their hand or something.
Any questions on the phone? Okay, Larry, it looks like we're clear here in the room and clear on the phone. We really appreciate information and very insightful as always. And as you know, you're welcome here at FEDC table anytime. So
Okay.
thank you again.
Well, I hope I make it up there soon. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Larry.
Bye-bye.
Try.